Lightning crackled across the pre-dawn sky as Mason Reed pushed open the cafe door, the warning rumble of thunder chasing him inside. The room smelled of warm croissants and freshly ground espresso. Patrons huddled over tablets and laptops, oblivious to the storm outside. Mason scuffed through the wet tile toward the counter, balancing the morning's first coffee and a half-wrapped blueberry muffin for his daughter. He tapped his card, collected the steaming cup, then froze mid-step. A sharp female voice, steady, then breaking, cut through the hum. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Your card has been declined." The barista's polite calm barely masked the sudden tension. Mason caught the woman's gaze across the room, her tailored trench and polished heels, a stark contrast to the disbelieving slump of her shoulders. He watched her lips press into a tight line, her world tilting on that single declined. Without thinking, Mason slid around the counter, held out his own card, and said, "It happens to the best of us. I'll cover it." Cameras would have loved that moment, the single dad stepping forward, thunder splitting the sky, and a nameless stranger saved by a simple act of kindness. If you've ever had your world upended by one small moment, let us know in the comments. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapters of this cinematic journey where every gesture can change a life. Mason Reed tucked a loose strand of hair behind his ear and felt the warmth of his own coffee seep into his palm. He'd learned early that nothing in life was guaranteed, not a steady paycheck, not even a working credit card. As a single father, he'd grown accustomed to tight budgets and tight schedules. The cafe's bright overhead lights glinted off the marble countertop, where the barista swiped cards and dished out orders with mechanical precision. Mason glanced at the line behind the woman whose card had failed suited commuters, tapping watches, yawning students scrolling news feeds. No one recognized the woman in the trench coat. Here, she was just another face in the crowd. He leaned in, sliding his card across the counter, careful not to touch her hands. His own fingers trembled slightly, partly from the storm outside, partly from the rush of adrenaline that came when he broke routine. "It's just coffee," he said, voice low but steady. The barista hesitated, then swiped his card. The machine beeped approval, and relief washed over the woman's face like sunlight piercing clouds. She murmured thanks, soft, genuine, laced with embarrassment, and Mason felt a spark of recognition in her eyes, a flicker that said she hadn't known what she needed until this moment. She collected her cup with a shy nod, cradling it as if afraid it might vanish. Mason noticed a splash of coffee still smudged on her pristine blouse, and before he could second-guess himself, he fished a napkin from his pocket and offered it. Her hand hovered, then took it, fingers brushing his in a ghost of contact that reverberated through him. He dabbed the stain without looking directly at her face, careful and respectful. An unspoken message that he saw her, not her status or her label. When he finished, she managed a small, stunned smile, and he gave a quick shrug as if paying for morning coffee and mopping up spills were equally meaningless and monumental. He turned to leave Muffin tucked under his arm, but paused by the door. She stood rooted behind the counter, phone in hand, phone likely dead, most likely discarded like so many in the crowd. She met Mason's gaze once more, and he saw vulnerability there, an almost invisible fissure in her armor. "What's your name?" she asked, voice barely above the cafe's soundtrack of frothing steam and low chatter. He opened his mouth, then realized she wasn't fishing for a dinner invitation or a follow on social media. She simply needed a name to anchor the memory of what had just happened. "Mason," he said. "Mason Reed." She repeated it, tasting the syllables as if saying them made the identity real. Then, as quickly as the storm had driven them together, Mason slipped out into the rain-slick morning, leaving her with a cup of coffee and a receipt that had his name printed in black ink. The door slammed shut behind him, and the cafe buzz resumed as though he'd never stepped in. But for Mason, the world felt a little sharper, more alive. He had done something small, something quiet, yet he felt the ripples carrying him forward. Outside, the rain had eased to a steady drizzle. Mason ducked under the cafe awning, opening his phone to check messages. Nothing urgent, just the usual stream of reminders to pay bills and schedule school pickups. He tapped on his banking app, confirming the charge, then locked the phone. The sky had lightened along the horizon, a promise that storms eventually pass, leaving freshness behind. He took a deep breath, lifted his coffee, and drank. The warmth settled in his chest, bringing clarity. Today, he would pick up his daughter from her after-school choir, maybe stop by the grocer for milk. Life's contours were simple: get by, show up, love fiercely. Yet in that cafe, in that brief exchange, he'd done something that mattered beyond his routine. He'd given dignity to someone who might have thought she'd lost it. Mason held the cup a moment longer, then headed to his car. He tucked the muffin into his jacket pocket, thinking of how small gestures can reshape a day, can widen a person's heartbeat, just enough to notice beauty in the ordinary. The cafe's neon sign flickered behind him, then steadied into a calm glow. Mason walked on wet pavement leaves, glistening like emeralds in the streetlight. In his mind, he replayed one thought: kindness needs no audience. It only needs a heart brave enough to act. As the city's pulse resumed around him, honking horns, distant sirens, the pulse of morning traffic. Mason Reed carried on, unaware that the woman at the cafe was already plotting her own detour from the path she'd known. But he felt something shift inside him, a gentle nudge toward noticing others in their moments of need. And in that shift, he sensed that life was far more expansive than any routine, full of unexpected chapters just waiting to be written. Brooke Sinclair stood, frozen coffee cup clutched loosely in one hand as the line behind her inched forward. For a heartbeat, she expected anyone to recognize her, the elegant silhouette of the CEO of Sinclair Holdings, the woman whose boardroom decisions shaped entire markets. Instead, the commuters eyed her like she was just another customer. A man in a subway uniform tapped his watch and cleared his throat. A young mother nudged her son to scoot along the bench. No whispered name, no deferential nod, just polite indifference. Her tailored trench coat felt suddenly heavy, the fabric pressing awkwardly against her shoulders. The barista handed her the coffee with a practiced smile, never so much as pausing to offer congratulations for her latest merger or to ask after the philanthropic initiative her foundation had just launched. Brooke blinked, her perfectly outlined world splintering around her. She had built her life on precision, flawless shoes, meticulous hair, an unbroken record of accomplishments. Yet here in the corner of an unremarkable cafe, none of it mattered. She was simply a woman with a cup of coffee, anonymous among a sea of faces. She lifted the lid and inhaled the dark roast's rich aroma, trying to steady herself. Each breath felt foreign, like learning to walk again. People shifted behind her, waiting for the next order. A businessman pressed his forehead against his hand, muttering about missing his train. Brooke fought the urge to apologize again, to explain who she was, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she made herself step forward. As she moved toward an empty high-top table, she caught her reflection in the glass door, her own image half-shadowed, half-lit by the cafe lights. The woman staring back at her looked uncertain, unmoored. Brooke straightened, smoothing the lapels of her coat. She reminded herself that power could be invisible too. No one had to see her to know she was influential. But the sting of this quiet erasure, it cut deeper than any public snub she'd endured. She settled at the table, setting her coffee on a napkin. The warmth seeped through the ceramic, grounding her. Outside rain began to streak the windows, mirroring the haze that clouded her mind. She watched droplets race each other to the sill, as if reminding her that even the fastest finish lines could be washed away. Brooke tapped the screened surface of her phone. No service. She had left her wallet in her office, confident she wouldn't need it, and her backup card was buried in her purse at home. Now she realized how tightly she'd wired her life for control and how swiftly it unraveled when one small thing went wrong. She stared at the blank screen, the sky-dark plum of its inactivity. Control, she thought, is a fragile thing. A barista hurried past, wiping down tables, and Brooke called after her. "Miss." The girl turned, tray in hand. "Everything okay?" Brooke managed a small smile. "Yes, thank you." The girl shot a sympathetic look but didn't linger. Brooke's shoulders sagged and she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the low hum of espresso machines wash over her. Somewhere in her mind, she cataloged the moment: the smell of coffee, the soft jazz filter playing overhead, the muted clatter of cups. Each detail, precious fragment she could replay later when she was back in her fortress of glass and steel, commanding board meetings and giving keynote speeches. But the truth was, this humbling moment felt more vivid than any staged summit or press conference. Her toast to anonymity was broken by a soft, "Excuse me." Brooke opened her eyes to see Mason Reed approaching, the single dad who had paid for her coffee. He tucked a lock of damp hair behind his ear, and in that instant she felt an echo of humanity she hadn't known she was missing. He offered her a small, earnest smile and said, "Just wanted to make sure your morning got back on track." She realized then that the morning was no longer about projections or presentations. It was about something far simpler, connection. "Thank you," she said again, her voice steadier now. He nodded and gave a quick wave, then turned and melted back into the crowd. Brooke watched him go, a sense of longing stirring in her chest. She had always measured her worth by outcomes, by the weight of her name. But here was someone who valued kindness over credentials, compassion over convenience, and that felt revolutionary. Rain pattered harder against the windows. Brooke stood lifting her coffee cup and took a long sip. The bitterness was a welcome jolt, sharp enough to wake her to possibility. No one here knew who she was, but maybe that was a gift. Without the halo of her reputation, she could simply be herself, imperfect, exposed, alive. She gathered her things and stepped out into the drizzle. The world beyond the cafe seemed both familiar and new. She walked to the elevator bay, pressing the button for the penthouse floor. As the doors closed mirror-like, she caught a glimpse of her reflection. This time she saw more than the CEO. She saw a woman who had been shaken awake. On the penthouse level, the soft click of her heels echoed through the marble foyer. The plush silence embraced her like a suit of armor, but today she allowed herself to notice each footfall, each breath. The executive assistant Mara appeared at the door to the office suite. "Good morning, Brooke," she said brightly. "You have a 900 call with New York, followed by lunch with the Newark development team." Her tablet glowed with carefully curated schedules. Brooke nodded and stepped past her. "Thank you, Mara." She paused at the office door, hand on the handle. The corridor was lined with abstract art and understated sconces, an environment designed to project power. Yet all Brooke could think about was the cafe, the anonymity, the abrupt unspooling of her status, the unexpected kindness of a stranger. Inside her office, she dropped her coat on the back of her chair and sank into the leather seat. The cityscape spread before her, steel towers, winding highways, the sprawl of lives she influenced from above. She reached for her laptop, intent on diving into numbers, projections, and agendas, but her fingers hovered over the keyboard, reluctant to break the spell of her morning epiphany. She closed her eyes, recalling Mason's quiet generosity, his unassuming presence. No boardroom had ever felt so small to her as these moments of simple humanity. With deliberate care, she opened a fresh calendar invite on her desktop, "Meet with Building Services." She typed 2:00 p.m. Mason Reed. Discuss something. Then she deleted it. She hesitated, saving and discarding the plan thrice before finally clicking save. Brooke leaned back, watching the light shift across the skyline. For years, she'd built her empire on control, on the certainty of her own decisions. But this morning had taught her that some of the most profound awakenings began in vulnerability, in the unplanned intersections of strangers. She realized that status was invisible until it was recognized, and sometimes the deepest connections stemmed from moments when no one recognized you at all. Her phone pinged a reminder of a conference call in 5 minutes. Brooke stood smoothing her skirt. She picked up the designer coat hung over her chair, slipped it on with renewed purpose, and strode out of the office. Today she decided she would step out of her comfort zone, not in search of applause, but in search of something far more valuable: authenticity. And for a woman who had once feared anonymity, that was the most radical move of all. Mason pressed the napkin gently against the dark stain spreading across Brooke's silk blouse, his touch deliberate and quiet. The steam from her coffee curled up around them, hazy as the pause that fell over the crowded cafe. For a moment, the clatter of ceramic mugs and the hiss of the espresso machine seemed to dim, drawing their eyes together. Brooke felt the warmth of his palm through the thin napkin, and in that breathless instant she saw something in his dark brown eyes, an unspoken understanding that transcended titles and strangers. Almost gone, he murmured, voice low enough that only she could hear. He straightened and gave her a brief, encouraging nod. Brooke wanted to thank him again, to tell him that this small act meant more than he could ever know. But he was already moving toward the door, coat flung over one shoulder, his gait relaxed yet purposeful. She blinked, confusion and gratitude warring on her features. "Mason," she called softly, voice barely louder than a whisper. He paused in the doorway, hand on the handle, and turned. His expression was calm, curious, like he might step back in to offer another kindness, or disappear into the morning crowd, leaving her with a sense of something left unsaid. "Just Mason," he said, offering a half-smile as he spoke his name. Then he slipped out into the rainy morning, the cafe door swinging shut with a soft click that echoed through her chest. Brooke watched him go, coffee cup and napkin still in hand as if rooted in place. Around her the cafe resumed its usual rhythm, baristas calling out names, spoons clinking against bowls, the low rumble of conversation. Yet for Brooke, Sinclair, CEO of Sinclair Holdings, time had shifted on its axis. Mason's name, so simple, felt like an anchor dropped into the chasm of her carefully curated world. She touched the damp napkin between her fingers and watched the ink bleed from the printed receipt into the fabric, the letters of her own name smudging into obscurity. No one here cared that she'd overseen a $40 million acquisition last quarter. No one asked if she'd forgiven her board for the gossipy whispers about her leadership style. She was for once invisible, just a woman in a cafe left breathless by a stranger's generosity. Finally, she tore her gaze away from the door and set her coffee on the table. The seat across from her was empty now, a silent testament to the moment that had just passed. Brooke found herself leaning forward, elbows on the rustic wood surface, tracing the grain with her fingertip as she tried to gather her thoughts. The rain pounding against the windows sounded like applause in her ears, a private ovation for the simple act that had undone her. She snapped her phone open, flicking through calendar alerts and unread messages, but a new notification had popped in the press release for her charity gala scheduled for 2 nights hence. She swiped it away, unable to concentrate. Normally, her world begged for every second of her attention. Investor calls, strategic briefs, tax filings. But all she could think of was Mason Reed, the single father whose card had saved her morning, whose eyes had held her steady. A barista called for the next order latte for Jessica. The line shuffled forward, and Brooke felt a surge of motion pulling her back to reality. She folded the napkin and tucked it into her coat pocket, then rose and wrapped her trench coat around herself. She left a generous tip on the tabletop, more than the coffee's cost, and slipped into the line once more, not to buy another drink, but to stand inside the world she'd almost forgotten. Back outside, the rain had all but stopped, leaving the pavement slick and glinting with streetlights. Brooke tilted her head to catch the first hint of sunrise breaking through the clouds. The city was waking up indifferent to the internal tremors of its most powerful residents. She walked toward the building's front entrance, her heels clicking with a newfound steadiness. As she stepped into the lobby, her reflection in the polished marble walls seemed unfamiliar, etched with a softness she'd never allowed herself. Security glanced at her badge, nodded, and let her pass. No fanfare, no recognition. It was as if the moment in the cafe had scrubbed her slate-clean CEO or not. She was simply Brooke. In the elevator, she brushed the napkin under her sleeve, the memory of Mason's kindness tucked close to her heart. The doors slid open on her executive floor, greeted by the hush of plush carpet and the subtle hum of air conditioning. Her assistant Mara stood by the glass-walled conference room, tablet in hand. Brooke, your 9 hours with New York just dialed in, and the team from Tokyo is on deck at 10. Brooke gave her a firm nod, but her mind lingered on a new to-do list: find Mason Reed. She realized she didn't know much about him, just that he worked somewhere in her building, that his life was probably riddled with its own challenges, and that he had seen her as more than a title. That perspective, it was a gift she couldn't ignore. She slipped into her office, the skyline view swallowing her in a familiar rush of power. Premium leather chairs, high-gloss desk, a dozen glossy awards lining the shelves. Brooke's hand hovered at the door's handle, torn between the pull of routine and the promise of something unexpected. She set her coffee down and closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. When she opened them, she reached for her phone and typed quickly. Mara, please pull the building directory and send me a list of all maintenance and facilities staff. I need to verify a name. She reread it, then hit send. Her assistant's prompt reply lit her screen. On it. Anything else? Brooke paused, her fingers hovering. Yes, she wanted to find him, but not to wield power or to satisfy curiosity. She wanted to thank him more fully, to see the man who had reminded her what it felt like to be seen as a person, not a persona. And she admitted to herself she wanted to let that stranger's kindness gently reshape her own heart. She glanced at the conference room door, then back at her phone. Book a one-on-one interview, she tapped. Mason Reed Facilities, 2:00 p.m. today in my office. No HR presence. She paused again, then added, "And include a second coffee." Her thumb hovered over. Send and Brooke closed her eyes, steadying herself. A million logistics waited, dozens of charts, press statements, board memos. But for the first time all morning, she felt the quiet hum of anticipation. Not for a deal or a keynote, but for the chance to honor a human connection before it faded. She pressed send, and with that small act of intention, stepped into a new rhythm, one where status could wait and kindness took the lead. The glass doors of her office reflected her poised and purposeful, and somewhere beyond the city's bustle, Mason Reed was about to walk into her world once more. Brooke closed the door behind her and exhaled, the soft click of the lock echoing in the marble foyer. The air in her penthouse felt impossibly still. Glass walls framing a city pulsing with life, every light, a story she usually controlled, yet tonight she felt adrift. She kicked off her heels at the bench, letting the tailored trench coat slip from her shoulders. In the kitchen, she poured a neat measure of whiskey and carried the tumbler to her living room, perching on the edge of the low leather sofa like a visitor in her own home. She flicked on the floor lamp, its warm glow cutting the gathering dusk. Her laptop sat open on the glass coffee table, spreadsheets and forecasts glaring up at her in neat rows. Normally, she'd dive right back in Q3 projections, shareholder ROI. The works. But tonight the numbers blurred. Every cell in every spreadsheet seemed to mock her, reminding her that data could only measure so much. Her heart beat too loudly in her ears. She could almost taste yesterday morning's coffee on her tongue. She lifted the glass to her lips and paused, letting the amber liquid coat her throat. Then she set the tumbler down and closed her eyes, letting the whiskey's warmth chase away the chill of the moment. Mason's face floated before her, his dark brown eyes steady, beneath a flicker of concern, the soft rumble of his voice, as he said, "Almost gone." The way he didn't demand thanks, the way he simply stepped back and let her carry on. She opened her eyes and reached for the napkin tucked in her coat pocket, the damp square of paper he'd offered to blot away the coffee stain. She unfolded it now, laying it on the coffee table. The printed receipt had bled into the fibers, her name and the cafe's logo smudging like a secret. She stared at it as if it were the most precious thing in her world, the single act that had cracked open her tightly wound life. "Why can't I stop thinking about this?" she whispered to the empty room. Her phone buzzed on the table, an urgent message from Mara, reminding her of the noon strategy call. She stared at the screen thumbnails of her leadership team, waiting for her direction. Brooke tapped out a quick reply, "I'll join in 5, then deleted the reminder notification. She couldn't face them just yet. Instead, she reached for her journal on the side table and flipped to a blank page. She wrote, "Haunted by kindness." Underneath, she drafted a note to herself. "Find Mason. Learn his story." A sigh escaped her as she capped her pen. She pushed herself up and drifted toward the full-height window. The city glittered like an unwritten promise, towers reaching for the sky as taxis streaked below. She pressed her palms to the cool glass, feeling the hum of millions of lives moving in patterns she used to dictate. But Mason Reed had shown her that a single ripple, a simple offer to pay for someone's coffee, could shift all the currents. Her phone buzzed again, an alert that her next investor report was due this afternoon. Brooke rubbed her temples and let her head tip back against the glass. Heat rose in her cheeks. She'd achieved every goal she'd ever set for herself, climbed every ladder, crossed every finish line. But this moment, this unexpected kindness, felt more urgent than any quarterly target. She turned away from the window and peered into the reflection of her office. The sleek desk, the gilded awards, the polished floor. It all looked sterile now, a stage for performances she no longer wanted to give. Brooke stepped forward and pulled open the top drawer. Inside her wallet lay alongside corporate credit cards and a handwritten note from her father. "Always keep your eyes ahead." She closed the drawer and ripped the note into pieces, letting it fall like confetti. Her eyes welled as she realized how many times she had pushed others aside in pursuit of that directive. Determined, she crossed to her phone again and opened her contacts. Mason Reed's name wasn't there, she'd never had it. So she tapped her building's directory and scrolled through staff listings until she found him under Facilities Mason Reed Maintenance. She hesitated, thumb hovering over his name. Then she opened a new calendar invite, 2:00 p.m., Brooke Sinclair and Mason Reed. She typed, "Let's continue our conversation. Coffee on me. No HR liaison. No assistance." She hesitated again, then clicked send. Her heart raced as the confirmation pinged back. She realized she was scheduling an appointment not with a business partner, but with a man who had seen her as a person. The implications spun in her mind, spending time away from investor calls, venturing into parts of the building she rarely thought about admitting vulnerability. It felt reckless and thrilling. A knock on the door frame startled her. Mara stood there, tablet in hand. "Brooke, the strategy call is about to start." Brooke raised a hand. "Cancel my first meeting. I'm rescheduling everything until after 2. I'll be in the cafe on the ground floor. Tell it I need remote access." Mara blinked but nodded, the professional mask slipping into something like curiosity. "Yes, of course." She turned to go, then paused. "Everything all right?" Brooke let out a breath and met her assistant's eyes. "More than all right." Mara disappeared and Brooke settled back onto the sofa. She wrapped her arms around herself, drawing in the scent of her sweater, and stared at the table where the napkin lay. The hours ahead would be unpredictable. She would share space with someone she barely knew, reveal parts of herself she usually kept hidden, and possibly uncover truths he didn't expect to revisit. No board meeting had ever asked so much of her. She took the napkin and pressed it to her heart. Then she closed her journal and tucked both into her briefcase, ready to step out into the world she'd briefly abandoned. The penthouse felt smaller now, more like a cocoon she'd shed. Brooke stood smoothing the front of her pantsuit and picked up her trench coat. She walked to the door and paused, taking one last look at the skyline. The city's lights winked back, inviting her to join its unpredictable dance. With a steadying breath, she opened the door and stepped into the hallway, her steps echoing on the carpet. Each footfall was a choice to lead with empathy, to honor a kindness that had awakened her to prove that true power begins with seeing one another. And in that quiet resolve, Brooke Sinclair found herself moving toward something far bigger than any deal she'd ever closed. Brooke rode the elevator down to the lobby, with her heart thudding so loudly she almost missed the chime. The morning light slanted through the towering glass facade, spotlighting motes of dust dancing in the concierge's wake. She stepped out into the hushed grandeur of the lobby marble floors, so polished they mirrored the ornate ceiling potted palms, lined like sentries, and the muted whoosh of the revolving doors pulling in the city's kinetic energy. But instead of striding confidently to her waiting car or ordering her usual driver to circle back, Brooke found herself drawn to a quieter corner almost against her own will. She paused by a sleek column of honed stone peering around its edge. There, beyond the gleaming brass front desk, she saw him. Mason Reed, her unwitting hero. He wore a faded navy polo shirt, no company logo, and jeans that had seen a dozen work weeks too many. His black sneakers bore scuffs that told stories of early shifts and long nights. Beside him, a janitor's cart stood laden not with accolades but with cleaning supplies, bleach and dingy plastic tubs, spray bottles, half-empty rags of gray and white. Brooke blinked against the brightness of the lobby lights as if the stark contrast between his world and hers might vanish if she looked away. But there he was, crouched before the glass-paneled doors. He sprayed a handful of disinfectant onto a cloth and wiped the stainless steel handles with the care one would give a fragile heirloom. At one point he paused to untangle the cart's stray wires, his movements patient, precise, the silent rhythm of a man who took pride in work most people refused to notice. She pressed herself tighter into the column's cool surface, adrenaline stirring in her veins. Brooke realized that in all the years she'd walked these floors, her heels clicking a staccato of authority, she'd never once considered the people who sustained the building's gleaming facade. Executives whizzed past him, unread memos in hand. Secretaries rushed to catch him holding doors. Security guards nodded a perfunctory greeting. Everyone took his labor for granted. Brooke, until yesterday's coffee, had been no different. He rose then, bending to place the cloth back in the cart's caddy. He straightened, surveyed his handiwork, and for a moment met Brooke's hidden gaze. Their eyes locked hers wide with something she couldn't name, his steady, with soft recognition, not of her face, but of shared humanity. A flicker of surprise passed through him, as if he'd sensed a presence he wasn't expecting. Brooke ducked her head quickly, heart-thundering grateful he hadn't called out her name. Mason wheeled the cart toward the elevator bank, pausing to offer the door to an elderly woman stepping through the glass doors. He greeted her with a gentle, "Good morning, ma'am," his voice low but warm. The woman smiled, clasped her purse a little tighter, and shuffled past. Brooke watched the exchange, the simple courtesy that had cost him nothing, but given someone the morning's first genuine smile. She straightened at last, smoothing the front of her pantsuit. For a heartbeat, she considered calling out to him to disrupt the smooth currents of his day. But she held back. Instead, she allowed herself a quiet moment to witness the scene, Mason's back steady as he turned down the corridor toward the supply closets, his cart's wheels whispering over the marble floor. He was anonymous again, the cloak of servitude settling over him the instant he passed beyond her view. Brooke stepped from behind the column and drifted toward the front desk. Not to summon assistance or flaunt her arrival, but simply to be present in the space she usually occupied only on her own terms. She caught the concierge's eye and offered a small nod of acknowledgement. No fanfare, just a recognition that she belonged here too, not as an overlord of commerce, but as a participant in the building's living pulse. Her phone buzzed an incoming notification that her 200 p.m. meeting with Mason Reed had been confirmed. She pressed it off, feeling the weight of her next steps settle into something solid. For the first time since the coffee shop, she didn't feel compelled to maintain perfect composure or to don the armor of confidence. Instead, she felt curious, an open question mark for the first time in years. Brooke crossed the lobby to the cafe doors. She paused at the threshold, the memory of Mason's kindness churning like fresh rain on her tongue. She stepped inside, inhaled the familiar scent of espresso and baked bread, and stopped short when she saw the same barista sliding a fresh cup across the counter. The cafe pulsed with the same morning rhythms, commuters catching up on news, students tapping out essays on tablets, business people scanning stock tickers on phones. But for Brooke, the scene carried a new texture, one woven from gratitude, vulnerability, and anticipation. She ordered a black coffee, no sugar, no frills, then moved to a high-top table by the window. She placed her bag on the stool, took out the napkin still tucked in her pocket, and laid it on the table like a talisman. When the barista handed her the steaming mug, Brooke cradled it in both hands, letting the heat seep into her palms. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds, streaking the sky with pale gold. The city beyond the window teemed with possibility, but in this moment Brooke felt she could hold worlds in her hands. She set the mug down and opened her journal, writing, "Only one line I saw him. I will remember." Then she closed it and lifted her gaze to the double doors leading back to the lobby. There, just beyond the glass, Mason reappeared, pushing his cart with resolute calm. He hadn't noticed her yet, absorbed in his work. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing a row of freckles that caught the morning light. Brooke watched him for a long moment, feeling the swell of something like hope. A man brushed past the doors, startling Mason's cart. The janitor righted the wayward wheel with an apologetic mutter, then continued on. Brooke rested her chin in her hand and sipped her coffee, tasting the bitterness and warmth together. The echo of Mason's gentle apology and meticulous care lingered on her lips. She closed her eyes briefly, remembering the ache of vulnerability when her card had failed the relief of his intervention, and now the rawness of seeing him in his true element. She had always believed that power lived in boardrooms and media headlines. But here behind the curtain of privilege, she saw power born of simple acts tending to the unnoticed, offering help without fanfare, standing firm in compassion. Brooke opened her eyes and straightened. She recognized that every skyscraper she'd built rested on foundations unseen: the custodial staff, the maintenance crews, the people who kept the lights on and the air flowing. And at the center of that foundation stood Mason Reed, quiet, unassuming, indispensable. She drained the last of her coffee and stood depositing the cup in the used mug bin. As she stepped back into the lobby, the clack of her heels sounded different, less like a declaration of authority, more like a beat in a larger rhythm she was just beginning to learn. She made her way toward the concierge desk where Mara's tablet lay atop a sleek stand. Her assistant's eyes met hers, curious but unasked questions tucked behind professional courtesy. Brooke gave Mara a single nod, indicating she was on her way to the cafe's back entrance. Mara tapped the screen, making a note. Brooke turned and walked back through the glass doors, for a second time the memory of Mason's steadfast presence guiding her steps. As the doors swished closed, Brooke felt a shift in the lobby's atmosphere, not in the marble floors or the polished counters, but in the unseen currents of her own spirit. The world she commanded from the penthouse felt irrevocably richer, more complex, infused with humanity. And in that realization she found the courage to follow Mason Reed out of the shadows and into the heart of her own story. Brooke slipped back into her office suite, the door whispering shut behind her, as if sealing off the rest of the world. The late morning glare slanted across her mahogany desk, illuminating the leather-bound planner she'd abandoned in her rush to the lobby. She tapped the card reader on the corner of her desk and felt the familiar click as her credentials unlocked the company's secure HR portal. The hum of the ventilation system sounded impossibly loud in the suddenly empty room. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, heart still pounding from the morning's discoveries. She typed Mason Reed's name into the search bar and held her breath. The screen blinked, then populated with a simple profile header: Mason Reed, Facilities, Employee ID 47391. Beneath it lay a terse table of fax hire date, pay grade performance reviews, attendance logs. Nothing in his personnel record hinted at the extraordinary man she'd glimpsed cleaning her door handle. She clicked through tabs with methodical precision: benefits, certifications, disciplinary actions, all blank. Then she found the previous experience link and clicked. A PDF opened Mason Reed's uploaded resume. The header bore his name in plain type, followed by an address in the city's Midtown district. No fancy letterhead, no corporate logo. She scrolled down. Education: Bachelor of Science in Computer Engineering, 2008, University of Illinois. Under professional experience, Senior Systems Engineer, Veltec Solutions. 2008-2015. Bullet points detailed. Quantum Net Infrastructure Design. Cross-platform. Redundancy audits. Cloud Bridge. Implementation. Each entry concise, technical, unmistakably high-level work projects that Fortune 500 clients had quietly lauded, though the public knew little of it. Then a blank space, and below it a single line in italics: 2015-2018, seeking purpose. No explanation, no euphemism for personal reasons, just that four-word phrase stark against the white background. Brooke exhaled, her chest suddenly tight. She clicked further: cover letter. Her own handwriting. No, not hers. The HR department's standardized header followed by text. Mason had submitted when reapplying for a building consultant role 6 weeks ago. She read after 5 years in systems engineering. I stepped away to address family matters and rediscover why I love building solutions. I'm not seeking pity or handouts, only the opportunity to contribute purposefully again. Thank you for your consideration. Her breath caught at the humility of those words. In the boardroom, purpose was a hollow buzzword. Here it was a lifeline. Brooke scrolled down to status rejected. Reason: incomplete history. A brief HR note in red: application gap too long. Candidate not eligible. She sat back, pulse thundering. Mason Reed's application had never made it past the first filter of a digital algorithm. No one had looked closer. Fragments of his story, the projects that powered global networks, the unexplained gap, had been dismissed out of hand. Yet here he was proving his worth every morning with the only tools he had: kindness and quiet competence. Brooke closed her eyes, trying to steady her swirling thoughts. She thought of last night, of the yank of vulnerability she'd felt in the cafe, of the small click inside her chest, when his generosity unwound her defenses. She thought of the lobby, of the way he treated every surface as precious, of the way he greeted an elderly resident as if she were the most important person in the building. And now she held the proof: a man of uncommon talent buried beneath corporate indifference. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, opening the Contact HR form. She paused at the comments field, then deleted everything. This wasn't a matter for human resources. It was something she needed to handle herself. Instead, she opened her calendar and created a new event: Mason Reed Office Consultation. She set the time for 2:00 p.m., far enough away to give herself time to prepare, but soon enough to seize the urgency of the moment. In the description, she typed one-on-one meeting, no panel, no assistance. Coffee provided. She clicked save and watched the confirmation pop up. Brooke sat forward, resting her chin on her hand. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the desk, painting the spreadsheet tabs in gold. She realized she'd never paused in her career to excavate someone else's record so thoroughly, yet here she had, because Mason had gifted her something priceless: a glimpse of humanity. She rose and moved to the floor-to-ceiling window, staring down at the city's veins of traffic. For years she had sought purpose in profits and strategy. Now she understood purpose as a resonance between people, the engineer who built invisible frameworks and the CEO who orchestrated visible ones. Their intersection was an unexpected spark, a collision of worlds most people never saw. Brooke turned and strode to the credenza, pouring herself another measure of whiskey. She set the tumbler on the desk, then opened a desk drawer and retrieved a leather portfolio, her meeting notes for the afternoon's investor briefing. She flipped through it, but the bullet points and talking points blurred. She closed the portfolio and laid it aside. She would prepare for that briefing tomorrow. Today, she had other priorities. Her phone buzzed again, a reminder about the investor call in 2 hours. She tapped snooze, then opened the internal messaging app. She typed to her executive assistant. Mara, please cancel my investor prep session today. I need to focus on an internal consultation. She hesitated, then added, details to follow. She hit send, her pulse steady. Now resolve tempered by the gravity of what lay ahead. Brooke took one last look at Mason's resume on her screen, the word seeking purpose resonating like a silent drumbeat. She closed the document and stood smoothing her suit jacket. She felt the tug of adrenaline, excitement, uncertainty, and a profound sense of responsibility. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped into the lobby with a different swagger, not the assured authority of a corporate titan, but the purposeful stride of someone determined to right a quiet wrong. She passed the column where she'd first seen him, staff moving like shadows around her. She glanced at the supply closet door where he'd slipped away. She breathed in the lobby's quiet hum, letting it settle in her bones. At precisely 1:58 p.m., she exhaled, lifted her chin, and walked toward the front desk. The concierge offered her a courteous nod, nothing more. Brooke smiled in return, feeling something lift inside her chest. She would meet him here in the place where they both belonged. He would arrive with his cart, with his uniform, with the dignity neither of them could afford to take for granted. And in that meeting, she vowed she would see him not as a maintenance worker or as a resume on a rejected list, but as the man whose kindness had opened the next chapter of her life. At 2:00 p.m., sharp, Brooke stood by the glass doors, the folder in her hand, both heavy and light. She felt the hum of the city below her penthouse, but for once she was utterly grounded, ready to build something together that no spreadsheet could measure. The knock on the glass door was soft but firm, and Brooke Sinclair looked up from her desk to see Mason Reed standing in the doorway. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the faded navy polo and scuffed sneakers almost incongruous in her sleek glass-walled office. Behind him lay the hum of the lobby, 50 floors below, but here it was quiet, just the muted echo of his footsteps entering the room. Mr. Amos, Reed, Brooke said, rising from her leather chair and extending her hand. Thank you for coming. He offered her a careful nod, relinquishing the janitor's cart handle to his free hand. His other hand reached out and their palms met a simple handshake, but for Brooke it felt like a crossing of worlds. He slipped into the guest chair without waiting for an invitation, settling into the low swivel seat with the ease of someone long accustomed to unassuming spaces. Brooke moved to the small refreshment bar at the side, pouring 2 cups of chamomile tea. Steam rose in delicate spirals. She handed one to Mason, noting the surprise in his dark eyes. I thought you might like something warm, she said. He cradled the ceramic mug, fingers brushing the lip. Thank you, he murmured, lifting it in a small salute. She returned to her desk, leaning forward with elbows on the polished surface. I asked you here because I owe you an apology, and because I want to hear your story in your own words. Her voice was steady, unadorned. Mason's gaze flicked to the rows of awards behind her head, then back to her. I didn't expect to be here, he admitted. I thought once HR rejected my application, that was the end of it. Brooke nodded. Their process is automated resumes evaluated by algorithms. A gap, no explanation. The software flags it. My fault is not looking beyond that flag. She paused, studying him. You should never have been discarded without a chance to explain. He looked down at his tea, lifting it to his lips in a slow sip. I appreciate you saying that. He set the cup on the coffee table between them. Then, as if steeling himself, he met her eyes. You asked for my story. I can start with why I left engineering. Please, Brooke encouraged, leaning forward again. Mason inhaled, shoulders straightening. Back in 2015, I was a senior systems engineer at Veltec Solutions. We were building cloud redundancy for global networks. I loved it. Late nights, tight deadlines, solving problems. Then my wife and son were in a car accident. They didn't make it. His voice cracked the movement so slight she almost missed it. He took another sip of tea, closing his eyes. I couldn't stay at my desk. Every time I walked into the office, I saw them in every corridor. I quit. I needed to step away from everything I knew. Brooke felt a lump in her throat, a sharp reminder that grief wasn't a buzzword. She sat back, uncrossing her legs, giving him space. Mason continued, voice steadying as he spoke through the past. For 3 years, I did anything I could find. I cleaned houses, helped friends' businesses, took night shifts in security. Eventually, I applied here just to fill a day with something familiar, routine. A purpose, however small. They slotted me into facilities. I take care of this building like it's someone's home, because it is right. People come here to work to chase their dreams. I make sure they can walk through these doors without thinking about the grime under their shoes. He managed a small, rueful smile. It's honest work. Brooke let the silence stretch, feeling the weight of his journey settle between them. She watched the way his hands clasped the mug, the slight tremor in his fingers, the resilience etched into his posture. Here was someone who had lost everything, yet found a way to keep giving, to keep caring. I'm so sorry for your loss, she said softly. I can't imagine how hard it's been. Mason set his tea down carefully. Thank you, he said simply. But it wasn't just the grief. It was losing faith in myself. When I came back, I thought no one would value what I had to offer, so I stopped asking. Brooke stood and moved to the side of his chair, placing a hand on his shoulder. You deserve better than hubris and algorithms. I've spent my life building empires and convincing myself that control was the point. But this your story, it's the point. He looked up at her, eyes wide with something like relief but also guarded hope. Why are you doing this? He asked. She met his gaze unflinching. Because I believe in seeing people. Not for their titles or their gaps, but for their humanity. I want to fix this not with HR forms, but with honesty. You'll get the chance to apply for a role that fits your skills and honors your experience. But first, I wanted to know you. Mason swallowed a slow nod. Thank you, he whispered. Brooke leaned back against her desk, flicking off the tension in her shoulders. The city's bustle muted through the double-paned windows, nothing but the distant hum of traffic and the faint notes of construction several blocks away. Inside, their tea cooled in the hush of the room. Do you ever miss engineering? She asked, voice casual but curious. He considered, gaze drifting to the skyline. Every day, he admitted. But I found something else, too. Connection. Knowing that someone's morning is a little better because I cared enough to wipe a handle. That means more than any back-end implementation. He turned back to her, genuine. I wouldn't have come back to tech if I thought I'd lose that again. Brooke smiled, the first real, unguarded smile she'd given all day. Then let's bring that connection to this company, too. We need your expertise and your empathy. Mason's brow rose. You really mean that? She nodded. I do. But let's leave the details of the role for tomorrow. Today I wanted you to tell me who you are. I've heard your story. Now I want you to know that it matters. He exhaled, leaning back in the chair as if testing the chair's support. It matters, he repeated, a quiet affirmation more to himself than to her. They sat together in the golden light spilling through the glass walls, CEO and janitor, engineer and empath. Two people who had bridged a chasm of assumptions with a single act of kindness and an honest conversation. When the clock on her desk chimed 3 times, signaling the hour, Brooke rose first. Thank you, Mason, she said, reaching out to shake his hand again. This time their grip was firmer, grounded in mutual respect. I'll see you soon. He rose as well, fingers brushing hers in a silent promise. I look forward to it, he said. As Mason gathered his cart and slipped out the door, Brooke watched his retreating figure, the curve of his shoulders steady beneath the weight of his own story. In that quiet exhale between meetings, she felt her own story expand, a narrative no algorithm could capture, woven from the threads of vulnerability, recognition, and the simple power of listening. And in the stillness of her office, she realized that leadership wasn't just about giving direction, it was about making space for others to be seen. Brooke waited until the elevator doors closed behind Mason before turning back to the expanse of her glass-walled office. The afternoon sun slanted in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting long rectangles of light across the plush carpet. On her desk lay the untouched offer letter she'd drafted, a blueprint for the lead systems consultant role she believed could bridge the gap between technology and humanity. Brooke pressed the polished wood edge with a thoughtful sigh, then rose and crossed to the credenza where 2 fresh cups of chamomile tea stood ready. She poured the steaming liquid into the mugs and carried one to the chair across from her, setting it down with a soft thunk. The gentle hiss of the ventilation system mingled with the distant hum of the city. When Mason returned, each footstep echoing softly on the marble floor, she offered him the cup. "Here," she said, voice steady. "Something warm before we get into business." Mason settled back into the chair, fingers curling around the mug's warmth. He met her gaze, a question in his dark brown eyes. "Thank you," he said, then paused. "I didn't expect to be offered anything beyond custodial." Brooke let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "That world is more valuable than people realize. But the truth is, I've never met anyone with your integrity and humility in a position like that." She stepped around her desk and returned, sliding the offer letter toward him. "I want you to lead our new digital infrastructure consulting team. You'll work directly with our CTO, overseeing cross-platform integration and user experience improvements. You'll mentor engineers, design processes that anticipate failures, and ensure our systems serve real people, not just metrics." He leaned forward, absorbing her words. The afternoon light glinted off the silver pen she'd placed beside the folder. Mason's gaze flicked from the folded letter to her face. "You want me for that?" His voice was quiet, incredulous. "I do," she said without hesitation. "Salary commensurate with your expertise. Full support from IT and facilities, everything you need to rebuild systems and guide teams." He picked up the letter and unfolded it, scanning the formal header, the bullet points of responsibilities, the compensation package. His jaw tensed slightly at the figures, more than he'd ever earned as an engineer and far above his janitor's wage. But his eyes rested on the final line. "Your integrity and lived experience are the greatest assets you bring." Mason closed the folder and cleared his throat. "I'm honored," he said softly, meeting her gaze again. "More than anything, I want to help people use technology without feeling hollow or afraid of making mistakes." Brooke smiled, stepping forward to stand beside the desk. "Exactly. And that's why you belong here." She paused, searching his expression. "Are there questions?" He nodded, rubbing his thumb over the mug's rim. "Just one," he said. "Why me? Why step outside HR channels to make this happen?" Brooke folded her arms across her chest, leaning back against the desk. "Because when someone shows you who they are in a moment of kindness, you pay attention. You don't let that slip away under layers of bureaucracy. You build something around it." Mason absorbed her answer, a thoughtful crease between his brows. He set the mug down, its rim catching the light in a glint. Then he reached into his pocket, producing a crumpled napkin, one of the originals she'd handed him after their first coffee. He tapped it against the desk so she could see the blurred ink. "One condition," he said, his voice steady, tinged with mischief. Brooke raised an eyebrow in surprise as he continued, "I accept the position on the condition that I pay for our next coffee." The words hung in the air, warm and unexpected. Brooke blinked to the afternoon sun, warming her cheeks. "Your coffee?" she asked, tone playful. Mason nodded. "It's symbolic. You covered the cost yesterday, now I'd like to cover it today. Equal ground." He offered a small grin, fingers tightening around the napkin. Brooke laughed softly, the sound bright and genuine. She crossed to him and held out her hand. "It's a deal, Mason Reed. I'll meet you at ground level in the cafe next week. Coffee's on you." He stood, shaking her hand firmly. The connection between them felt electric and natural all at once. "Looking forward to it," he said. Brooke stepped back and gathered the folder from his hand. She tucked it under her arm, not in haste, but with purpose. "I'll have the IT team send you a secure laptop. We'll start planning your roadmap on Monday morning." Mason nodded, slipping the folder into his own bag. He drained the last of his tea set, the mug on Brooke's desk, and turned toward the door. As he stepped out, he paused and offered one final thought. "Thank you, Brooke, for seeing me." Brooke watched him go, the gentle cadence of his footsteps receding down the marble corridor. She closed her eyes and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. When she opened them again, something fundamental felt different, a spark of hope lighting the corners of her carefully ordered life. She crossed back to the window and looked out at the city skyline, the glass towers bathed in late afternoon gold. Below, the streets pulsed with possibilities. Brooke Sinclair had offered a man a chance to rebuild not just systems, but trust and purpose. And he had met her condition with a simple act of reciprocity, paying for the next coffee. It was a small gesture, but in her world it was revolutionary. Brooke turned from the window and sat at her desk, opening her planner to Monday's page. She wrote at the top in bold script, Mason Reed, lead consultant. Beneath it she scribbled, listen, learn, build together. Then she closed the planner and leaned back, the afternoon sun soft on her face. Outside, the city prepared for evening. Inside, a new partnership had been forged, one built on kindness, respect, and the promise of equal ground. And in that quiet, unassuming moment, Brooke realized that the most profound transformations often start with the simplest terms. Mason's first morning back in a professional role felt both familiar and surprisingly new. He arrived before dawn, the lobby lights still dim, and took the service elevator to the 22nd floor. Instead of his janitor's cart, he carried a slim laptop bag and wore a crisp button-down shirt with his name badge clipped over the pocket, Mason Reed led systems consultant. He paused outside the glass double doors labeled Mercer Digital and took a steadying breath. The hum of fluorescent lights greeted him as he stepped into the open-plan workspace, rows of desks alive with silent screens awaiting his direction. He settled at the desk Brooke had prepared for him. Dual monitors, a whiteboard wall, a sticky note that read, "No rush, but we're thrilled you're here." He booted up his machine and surveyed the landscape of internal tools, dashboards overflowing with performance metrics, ticket tracking systems that never closed cases, error logs that culminated in buried alerts. He let the steady rhythm of fan noise wash over him, and then he began to sift through the layers of complexity, not with a sense of conquest, but with curiosity. Mason's approach was patient. He spent the first days on the floor, not in the executive suite, observing the help desk team as they fielded frantic calls, shadowing the customer success group as they stitched together workarounds for frustrated clients, sitting quietly with developers whose shoulders rounded beneath the weight of unrelenting deadlines. He asked questions in hushed tones. What stops you from doing your best work? Or where have you seen frustration break someone's flow? He listened more than he spoke, his gaze steady and unhurried. In every exchange, he seemed to acknowledge the person before him, not the role they occupied, and that simple recognition began to uncoil the tightly wound stress that had settled over the floor. By midweek, Mason convened a small meeting with key stakeholders, the head of IT, two senior developers, a UX designer, and Brooke herself. They gathered around his whiteboard wall, sipping coffee he'd insisted on bringing himself. He sketched a rough flowchart of the current ticket resolution process, a maze of automated escalations and siloed handoffs that often left end users stranded. Then he traced a new path, one that prioritized human touchpoints. Added quick, "How can I help check-ins?" and built in immediate feedback loops. He spoke softly, explaining that a system could process 1,000 tickets an hour, but if a single person felt unheard, the technology had failed. The room sat in an attentive hush, unpacking each line as if it contained an unexpected promise. They spent the afternoon refining the model. Developers nodded as they tagged improvements. Auto-response acknowledges known issues, but let's script a friendly follow-up in plain English. The UX designer added, "We can rephrase error messages to guide users, not blame them." The head of IT sketched out how to tweak server alerts so on-call staff could intervene before problems escalated. For the first time in months, the team seemed energized by possibility rather than crushed by the backlog. Mason didn't claim credit. He simply guided the discussion until the frenetic energy of responsibility transformed into the calm momentum of collaboration. Word of Mason's quiet transformation spread organically. Corridor conversations shifted from complaints about runaway bug reports to curiosity about the new human-centric process they'd pilot next week. Employees lingered longer in the break area, sharing stories of how a user had felt heard at last. People offered suggestions, small tweaks to the intranet homepage to simplify navigation, a daily digest that flagged critical alerts alongside words of encouragement, a rotating peer recognition banner celebrating unsung heroes across the company. Mason took notes in a leather-bound journal capturing every idea without judgment, as if each one were a bead in a tapestry he was weaving. Brooke watched these changes with a quiet pride that surprised her. She found herself lingering near his desk offering pastries or simply pausing to ask how his weekend had been. Mason greeted her as a colleague, not as a janitor-made consultant, but as someone whose insights held weight. When she mentioned her own frustrations with the investor portal's clunky design, he pulled up the screen on her laptop and proposed a series of incremental improvements. Clearer labeling, intuitive filters, a progress bar that didn't vanish after submission. She'd flick through his mock-ups and feel the familiar twinge of excitement that only genuine progress could bring. Later that week, Brooke and Mason walked together through the bullpen. She noticed how developers glanced up from their screens when he passed, some offering a nod or a brief smile, the unspoken acknowledgement of shared purpose. A junior engineer even paused to ask his advice on a configuration issue, something none of them would have dared just days before. Brooke realized that the change in atmosphere was profound. The culture was no longer one of endless demand and scarcity, but of collective care and possibility. One evening, as Mason prepared to leave, Brooke intercepted him by the lobby doors. The sky was a dark cobalt through the glass, the city lights flickering like distant stars. She offered him a to-go cup of coffee, her turn to treat him. He accepted with a grin, the twinkle in his eyes reflecting gratitude and mischief. "Thank you again," she said, voice soft, "for everything you're doing here." He held the cup to his chest, nodding. "I appreciate the invitation," he replied. "I've never worked someplace where people feel safe to speak up." Brooke looked up at the carved ceiling, recalling the early days of corporate success, when her own team had buzzed with ideas until exhaustion took hold. "I've learned you can't build a company on fear or perfection," she said. "You have to build it on trust." Mason's gaze settled on her, calm and certain. "Trust starts when someone listens," he offered. It was a truth so simple it seemed radical. Brooke smiled, a genuine warmth lighting her features, and they stepped out into the electric pulse of the evening. As they parted by the valet station, him returning to his modest apartment downtown, her to a penthouse that still felt strangely foreign, she felt the stir of transformation she had witnessed, a company lifting its collective gaze, guided by the quiet power of one man's integrity. Inside, Mercer Digital fluorescent lights no longer felt harsh, but bright with possibility. Ticket queues began to shrink as resolution times improved. User satisfaction scores crept upward. The digital help desk, once a faceless monolith, became a beacon of empathy under Mason's stewardship. Managers reported fewer escalations, and the daily status meetings, once a litany of grievances, transformed into solution-driven conversations. Brooke walked the corridors with renewed purpose. She stopped by the cafeteria to thank a team member for proposing the new Feedback Friday session. She smiled at the receptionist who greeted her by name. Everywhere she went, the air felt less heavy, as if the walls themselves had absorbed Mason's influence. Late that week, she found a note on her desk, handwritten on the same coasters she'd always used. "Thank you for seeing me. Now, the real work begins." Signed simply, Mason. Brooke held the paper to her chest, feeling the quiet transformation settle into her bones. She folded the note and tucked it into her planner. Then she closed her laptop and stood, the weight of responsibility balanced by the lightness of possibility. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mercer Digital hummed with newfound energy. And in that gentle uplift, Brooke realized that true transformation wasn't heralded by grand speeches or flashy announcements. It grew in the soft wake of genuine listening, deliberate action, and the promise that every person, even those once overlooked, might shape the future together. It was barely 9:15 on a gray Monday morning when Brooke's phone buzzed insistently. "Board meeting, 10:00 a.m., urgent." She straightened her blazer, slipped on her heels, and headed to the executive elevator, the gentle hum of the cables, a faint counterpoint to her racing thoughts. In the marble-lined hallway outside the Mercer Digital boardroom, she paused to smooth the front of her pantsuit. A leak. A confidential internal memo questioning her leadership had found its way to the press, accusations of reckless decision-making, misalignment of strategy, and talk of an imminent board shakeup. Brooke inhaled, bracing herself. Inside the boardroom, a long mahogany table glowed under recessed lights. 12 board members sat clustered around it, murmuring sharply in small groups. When Brooke entered, the chatter stilled like a tide receding. At the head of the table, Chairman Lewis Carlton gave her a curt nod. "Thank you for joining us, Brooke," he said, voice cool. "We've all read today's headlines. We need answers." Brooke nodded and took her seat. "I understand your concerns," she replied evenly, placing her tablet on the table. "I'd like to address them directly." Before she could continue, the chief compliance officer, an austere woman named Patricia Nguyen, interrupted. "The memo alleges that you bypassed review protocols and unilaterally greenlit the Halbert merger. Investors are panicking. Share prices have dipped 5% already." Her finger tapped the table, a metronome of accusation. Brooke exhaled. "I did authorize accelerated due diligence for Halbert, yes, but only after the standard risk assessment came back clean. The process was documented, signed off by legal and finance. The leak misrepresents our protocol." Several directors exchanged uneasy glances. Lawrence Finch, a veteran investor, leaned forward. "Then explain why the memo says the regional teams were never alerted and that critical compliance checkpoints were skipped." Brooke pointed to Patricia's tablet. "That language is not in any of our reports. Someone created a false version of the memo, then distributed it to the press." She met Lawrence's gaze. "We need to identify the source." Murmurs rippled through the room. Carlton folded his hands. "We will launch an investigation, but in the meantime, investor confidence is eroding. We need leadership accountability." Brooke felt the room tilt against her. She swallowed. "I'm prepared to cooperate fully, but I would ask that we not rush to judgment without the facts." The tension swelled until a quiet voice cut through it. Mason Reed, standing at the back of the room. Brooke's breath caught. She hadn't invited him to this meeting. He was here on a separate consultant invitation this morning. The board members stiffened as Mason stepped forward, hands tucked in his pockets, eyes level. Mr. Reed Carlton's voice cracked with surprise. "This is a closed session." Mason held up a hand. "I understand. But as lead systems consultant, I have evidence regarding the flow of that memo." His calm presence filled the room. "If you'll permit me to speak, a beat of silence." Carlton nodded reluctantly. "Proceed." Mason turned to face the directors. "I've audited our communication logs this morning. The version of the memo that leaked originated from the Southeast Regional Office, specifically from an email account flagged twice for failing compliance reviews. It was edited to add sensational language before being forwarded externally." He walked to the whiteboard and sketched a simple flow HQ, Southeast Region, edited version, press. The actual HQ document never contained those claims. The metadata confirms this file was tampered with at 3:12 a.m. by a regional coordinator, not by any executive office. A collective intake of breath filled the room. Brooke felt her pulse steady as Mason laid out the facts, his voice measured like water smoothing stone. Patricia Nguyen frowned at her tablet. "Are you certain?" Mason nodded. "I cross-checked with IT. Here are the logs." He passed printed copies around server timestamps, file hashes, IP addresses. The board members pored over them, brows furrowing, eyes widening. After a moment, Lawrence Finch spoke. "So this memo was forged at the regional level to undermine HQ." Mason turned back to Brooke. "It appears someone wanted to destabilize confidence in your leadership by manufacturing a crisis." Brooke rose, seizing the momentum. "Ladies and gentlemen, our real issue today isn't my decision-making. It's a security breach and an act of sabotage against this company. I recommend we revoke access for the Southeast office pending a full audit, and we press charges if the evidence leads to malicious intent." Carlton leaned back, voice softer now. "Brooke, I apologize for the rush to judgment. Thank you, Mason, for uncovering this." He addressed the board. "Let's vote on Brooke's recommendations: immediate suspension of the suspect account, an internal investigation, and legal referral." Hands rose around the table, unanimous. A low murmur of relief passed through the room as the tally was announced. Carlton cleared his throat. "Ms. Sinclair, we stand corrected. We appreciate your transparency and Mason's thorough investigation." Brooke offered a genuine half-smile. She met Mason's eyes across the table, gratitude shining there. "Thank you," she mouthed. The chairman nodded to Mason. "Mr. Reed, if you'll stay on to assist with the technical aftermath, we'd be grateful." Mason inclined his head. "Happy to help." Then as the meeting dissolved into procedural chatter, he turned to Brooke. "You did what you had to do," he said quietly. "And you did it with integrity." Brooke exhaled, the boardroom's tension melting. "I couldn't have done it without you," she admitted. They gathered their things as the boardroom emptied. Outside, the city roared back to life, unaware of the crisis that had nearly derailed Mercer Digital. Brooke and Mason emerged into the hallway together, the soft glow of recessed lights guiding them. She slipped her arm through his, a gesture of camaraderie rather than ceremony. In that silent corridor, Brooke realized that leadership wasn't just about making the right call. It was about standing firm when others faltered and having allies who would speak the truth on your behalf. And as they walked side by side toward the elevators, she knew that trust once broken could be rebuilt by simple acts of defense and conviction. The sun rose soft and golden as Brooke, Mason, and Lily rounded the corner onto the cobblestone stretch of the farmer's market. Tents blazed with color heirloom tomatoes stacked like rubies. Baskets of eggs shaded white and speckled jars of honey catching the morning light like liquid gold. The air smelled of fresh-baked bread and ground coffee, mingled with the earthy sweetness of just-picked berries. Lily skipped ahead, her pigtails bobbing as she trailed behind a string of ladybugs crawling over a display of wildflowers. "Daddy, look!" she squealed, kneeling beside a cluster of daisies. Mason crouched beside her, brushing a lock of hair from her forehead. "Those little guys are on a mission," he murmured, pointing as one ladybug took flight. Lily's laugh tinkled like wind chimes, and Brooke found herself smiling before she even set foot on the grass. They paused at a pancake cart, manned by a grandfatherly man in a flour-dusted apron. The sizzle of batter meeting griddle filled the air, punctuated by the hiss of steam from tiny spatulas. 3 blueberry flapjacks. 1 for Miss Lily, 1 for you, Mason, and 1 for me. Classic with extra syrup, Brooke ordered, leaning on the counter and relishing the first carefree moment she'd allowed herself in weeks. She tucked her trench coat over her arm and brushed a stray hair behind her ear, marveling at how light her heart felt. As the pancakes stacked high, Lily hopped onto a wooden stool, eyes wide with anticipation. The vendor slid Lily's pancakes onto a paper plate, blueberries bursting like midnight stars among the golden batter. He drizzled a ribbon of maple syrup over Brooke's stack, then passed a small dish of strawberry jam. On the house, he winked at Brooke, recognizing her from the boardroom a few weeks earlier. "Thank you," Brooke said, surprised and delighted. She unscrewed the jam jar's lid and dipped her finger in coating it with scarlet sweetness before spreading it in thick swirls across her pancakes. Mason watched her, his eyes soft. "Good choice," he said, picking up a fork and stabbing a corner of his own pancake. He tilted his head, lifting the bite to his lips and closing his eyes. Perfectly balanced, he declared his usual reserve melting. Lily grabbed her own fork and tried to mimic them, an oversized maple-drizzled bite wobbling precariously. She squealed when it slid onto her tongue, syrup pooling at the corner of her mouth. Brooke laughed and leaned over to wipe it away with a napkin, her fingers gentle against Lily's cheek. "Messy's half the fun," she teased, painting a dot of maple on her own chin. They settled at a wrought iron table under a canopy of string lights left over from Saturday night. Birds trilled from a nearby tree, and the gentle hum of stalls opening for business provided a backdrop richer than any boardroom could offer. Brooke took in the scene, Mason's easy smile, Lily's sticky fingers, the vendor bustling to refill trays of pastries. She realized how much she'd craved normalcy, this unhurried ritual of weekend mornings, where decisions weren't measured in profit margins but in moments of joy. So Brooke said, leaning forward, "What's on our agenda today?" She reached for her coffee cup, strong, black, and steaming. Lily flopped onto Mason's lap, tucking her chin into his shoulder. "I want to get jam," she announced, "and maybe those cinnamon buns over there." Mason laughed. "Jam shopping is serious business," he agreed, shrugging her into his arms. He offered Brooke a bite of his pancake with jam. "Try this blend raspberry and vanilla." Brooke accepted the bite, her eyes widening at the creamy swirl of flavors. You've got quite the palate, she said, impressed. Mason shrugged modestly. I've learned to appreciate small details, he replied. Between bites, they wandered through the market, Lily skipping ahead to a pottery stand, choosing a tiny mug painted with sunflowers. Brooke admired the delicate craftsmanship, chipped only slightly at the rim, but perfect in its imperfection. This would look lovely in your kitchen, Mason suggested, watching Brooke cradle the mug. She nodded, picturing it on her own shelf among sleek glassware. It reminds me that beauty doesn't have to be flawless, she said. They moved on to the jam stall where rows of preserves glinted in the morning light. Labels boasted wild strawberry, honey, peach, lavender, blueberry. Lily sampled spoonfuls with the vendor's permission, her eyes widening at each new taste. Brooke paused before a jar of elderflower cordial, inhaling its delicate fragrance. The vendor caught her gaze and pressed her a small sample, adding, "Perfect with sparkling water." Brooke smiled, tucking the bottle into her basket. Mason selected a jar of spiced apple butter, reading its label aloud, cinnamon nutmeg and a hint of clove. Brooke teased, "You're going to turn our pancakes into a spice festival." He grinned. "Hey, variety is the spice of life, right?" Brooke caught Lily's disapproving pout. She hadn't yet tasted this newcomer. Mason scooped a small spoonful for Lily, who licked it and nodded solemnly. Approved, she declared, and they added it to the growing pile. They lingered at a flower stall next Lily, plucking a single daisy to tuck behind Mason's ear. He pretended to be embarrassed, then bowed dramatically before Brooke earning a delighted laugh from her. She reached out to straighten his shirt collar, lingering on his shoulder blade, with the gentle touch of someone discovering affection. Mason's cheeks warmed, but his eyes held hers as if asking permission. Their laughter drifted through the market, a joyful murmur blending with the morning's chorus. The simple acts of choosing jams, sampling pastries, and teasing one another formed a rhythm neither had known they needed. Brooks felt a healing ripple pass through her chest, smoothing the jagged edges of boardroom pressures and relentless schedules. Here with Mason and Lily, she was neither CEO nor consultant, just another person enjoying sun-drenched moments of sweetness. As noon approached, they claimed a picnic bench beneath a blossoming cherry tree. Mason unpacked their hall mugs of tea jars of jam-fragrant bread and Lily's pottery sunflower mug. He spread a checkered blanket on the grass, and they laid out the feast like a family tableau. Lily dove into her favorite cinnamon bun, smudging her chin with sugar, while Brooke handed Mason a cup of those elderflower spritzers, the bubbles tickling his nose. He inhaled, savoring the delicate scent. Brooke raised her glass in a mock toast. To new tradition, she said, meeting Mason's gaze, then toasting Lily, who giggled and raised her own jam-coated paw. Mason joined in. To simple moments, he replied, and their cups clinked. They ate and chatted, a conversation woven from everyday threads. Lily's school play auditions. Mason's plans for a weekend bike ride. Brooke's reflections on her own foundation's upcoming charity event. There were no spreadsheets, no strategic pivots, just dialogue as natural as the breeze rustling cherry blossoms above. Later, as the sun dipped toward its afternoon peak, Lily climbed into Brooke's lap, draped in pancake crumbs and sunshine. Brooke wrapped her arms around the little girl, breathing in the scent of vanilla and fresh hair. "You're my favorite, Lily," declared, yawning. Brooke kissed her forehead. "Mine too." Mason draped an arm around them both, pulling them into a warm three-way hug. They lingered in the dappled light, the city's hum distant across the river. Each inhale tasted of gratitude for second chances, for unexpected friendship, for the chance to build something whole from fragments of kindness. In the hush of midday, they found a rhythm that belonged only to them, a tapestry of laughter, jam-smeared smiles, and shared silence. With the picnic remnants packed away in their reusable bags, they rose and walked back through the market. Lily holding hands with both her mother and Brooke, a small symbol of the family they were forging step by step. Vendors called after them, offering waves and samples, as if the market itself recognized the new glow around them. By the time they emerged onto the street, the afternoon sun had softened and the shops beyond the market glowed with promise. They paused at the crosswalk cars, waiting patiently, and Brooke looked at Mason. "Thank you," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. Mason squeezed her hand and glanced at Lily, whose eyelids fluttered sleepily. "Thank you for letting me share this," he said. Brooke smiled, heart full. "It's the best workday I've ever had." They stepped off the curb together, weaving toward home in a quiet new harmony. Pancake crumbs on their closed jars of jam in their arms, and laughter echoing through their hearts. The sky was a deep indigo when Brooke led Mason up the narrow stairwell to her rooftop terrace, the city's skyline a glittering silhouette against the last light of dusk. Mason followed Lily, tucked safely in her stroller eyes, heavy with sleep. The rooftop was transformed by a canopy of string lights, each bulb a warm promise suspended overhead. A few potted ferns and a wooden bench made the space feel more like a secret garden than the top of a skyscraper. Brooke set Lily's stroller aside and crossed to a small tea table where 2 mugs and a thermos of chamomile already waited. Mason leaned against the metal railing, looking out at the sea of lights below. "I never knew downtown could look so peaceful," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Brooke poured tea into their mugs, the steam curling like smoke from a tiny fire. She handed one to Mason, then cradled the other in her own hands. "It's quieter up here," she replied, settling on the bench beside him. "A place to remember why we do what we do." Mason took a sip, eyes closing at the gentle sweetness. "Perfect," he murmured, setting the mug on his knee. They sat in companionable silence, the soft hum of the city like distant waves lapping at the shore. Lily's stroller sighed as she settled deeper into sleep, tiny feet twitching in dreams. Brooke reached for Mason's hand, their fingers weaving together naturally. He turned his palm up, giving hers a reassuring squeeze. "You've changed this company," she said, voice low and candid. Not with grand gestures, but simply by showing up. Mason met her gaze, the string lights reflecting in his eyes. "You gave me a chance to show up," he replied. "You trusted me when everyone else looked away." They leaned into each other against the bench's back, shoulders touching, and the mug of tea warmed Brooke's chest. She traced the rim of his cup with her thumb, remembering how unassuming that first coffee had felt, and how little she'd known of its power. "I used to think leadership meant making the biggest decisions," she admitted. "Now I know it's about the quiet choices. The ones that say, 'I'm here, you matter.'" Lily stirred in her stroller, eyelids fluttering open. She reached out a chubby hand toward the lights overhead, as if trying to catch one of the glowing orbs. Brooke smiled and leaned forward to tuck a blanket around her daughter. "Hey, sleepyhead," she whispered. "We're almost done up here." Mason stood and joined them, brushing his hand against Lily's hair. "How's my favorite girl?" he asked, cupping her cheek. Lily's eyes focused on his face, and she gave a small, triumphant grin before drifting back to sleep. Mason lifted her gently and carried her to Brooke's lap, where she curled against her mother's side. Brooke watched Mason's careful movements, the way he cradled Lily, as if she were more precious than any boardroom document. Her heart swelled with gratitude for his kindness that morning in the cafe, for his steady presence through every upheaval, and now for this, his gentle care for their daughter. "Thank you," she said softly, resting her head against his shoulder. Mason dipped his mug in a silent salute. "Thank you for sharing this with me," he replied. He turned his head slightly, letting his cheek brush against hers. The lights overhead twinkled like distant stars, as if celebrating the tender moment. Brooke closed her eyes, breathing in the crisp night air. She didn't need to promise her heart with flowery words or grand commitments. This simple ritual tea under the skyline, hands intertwined. 2 hearts finding home in each other, spoke more eloquently than any vow. "I'm staying," she whispered. "I'm here." Mason's lips curved in a smile she could feel more than see. He kissed the top of her head, then sipped his tea. "And I'm right here," he answered. They sat like that, 3 souls bound by unseen threads, in the hush between the city's pulse and the night's quiet breath. No flashing cameras, no boardroom drama, just the gentle rise and fall of Lily's breathing and the warmth of their joined hands. As the string lights hummed with soft electricity overhead, Brooke realized that this moment encapsulated everything she had learned, that true leadership wasn't about wielding power, but about offering presence. That love wasn't proven through declarations, but through quiet, unwavering companionship. The city lights flickered below each one, a reminder of lives unfolding in complexity and haste. Yet up here, time slowed, and in the gentle glow, Brooke and Mason found the unspoken strength that arises when 2 people choose to simply be there for each other. No ceremony required, no promises scripted, Just an honest commitment carried in the soft touch of interlaced fingers and the shared warmth of chamomile tea.